In the realm of juvenile justice, there exists a delicate balance between holding young people accountable for their actions and recognizing that adolescence is fundamentally a time of learning, growth, and inevitable mistakes. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom has long been a place where this balance is struck with wisdom and compassion, where young defendants discover that consequences don't always have to be punitive, and where life's most valuable lessons often emerge from moments of poor judgment and the wisdom of adults who remember what it was like to be young and foolish. The story that would unfold on a gray Tuesday morning in November was destined to become one of Judge Caprio's most memorable interactions with a teenage defendant, a case that would demonstrate how the right mentor at the right moment could transform a young person's biggest mistake into the foundation for a lifetime of better choices. It was a story that would remind everyone present that teenagers aren't just smaller adults who should know better, but developing human beings whose brains are still forming, whose judgment is still maturing, and whose futures can be shaped by how the adults in their lives respond to their inevitable errors. 17-year-old Marcus Washington sat in the back row of the Providence Municipal Court waiting area, his tall frame hunched forward as he stared at his hands, trying to process the series of decisions that had led him to this moment. 6 months earlier, Marcus had been an honor roll student at Classical High School, a starting forward on the varsity basketball team with college scouts showing interest, and a young man his mother frequently bragged about to neighbors and co-workers. Now, he was facing charges that could derail everything he had worked for, the result of one night when peer pressure, teenage bravado, and spectacularly poor judgment had collided in a way that would change his life forever. The charge that brought Marcus to Judge Caprio's courtroom was vandalism. Specifically, he and 3 friends had been caught spray-painting graffiti on the side of a local community center that served as an after-school safe haven for younger children in their neighborhood. What made the offense particularly serious was that the community center was beloved by residents, staffed by volunteers, and operated on a shoestring budget that made the cost of cleaning and repainting the damaged wall a significant financial burden. Marcus had never been in trouble with the law before this incident. His mother, Patricia Washington, a single parent who worked as a certified nursing assistant at Rhode Island Hospital, had raised him with clear expectations about respect, responsibility, and making good choices. She had sacrificed enormously to provide Marcus with opportunities she had never had, keeping him enrolled in basketball leagues that required expensive equipment and travel, helping him with homework late into the night despite her own exhaustion from 12-hour shifts, and constantly reinforcing the message that education and hard work were his tickets to a better life than the one she had been able to provide. The night of the vandalism, Marcus had been hanging out with friends who weren't part of his usual circle. Older teenagers with reputations for pushing boundaries and testing limits. Marcus knew his mother wouldn't approve of these friendships, but at 17, the pull of seeming mature and being accepted by the cool kids had temporarily overridden the values that had been instilled in him since childhood. When one of the boys produced cans of spray paint and suggested they make their mark on the community center wall, Marcus had felt the familiar teenage tension between doing what he knew was right and proving he wasn't a goody-goody who was afraid to take risks. The decision to participate in the vandalism had taken perhaps 30 seconds of peer pressure, but its consequences had been unfolding for months. Marcus and his friends were caught by a security camera, their faces clearly visible as they defaced property that belonged to their own community. The shame Marcus felt when the police arrived at his home the next morning was compounded by seeing the disappointment in his mother's eyes, a look that haunted him more than any legal penalty ever could. Patricia Washington's reaction to her son's arrest had been a mixture of heartbreak, anger, and fierce protectiveness. She was devastated that Marcus had made such a poor choice, furious that he had jeopardized his future for something so meaningless, but also determined to stand by him as he faced the consequences of his actions. She had used her limited savings to hire a lawyer, taken time off work she couldn't afford to lose for court appearances, and spent countless hours trying to help Marcus understand the gravity of what he had done while also reassuring him that this mistake didn't define who he was or what he could become. The months leading up to their court date had been difficult for both mother and son. Marcus had been suspended from the basketball team pending resolution of his legal troubles, which meant losing the platform that had been generating college interest and potentially closing off scholarship opportunities he had been counting on. His grades, which had always been strong, began to slip as the stress and shame of his situation affected his ability to concentrate on schoolwork. Worst of all, Marcus found himself withdrawing from the positive influences in his life, coaches, teachers, and friends who had always supported him, because he was convinced they now saw him only as a criminal who had thrown away his potential. Patricia watched her son struggle with the consequences of his poor judgment and felt her heart breaking a little more each day. The young man who had once been confident and outgoing had become quiet and withdrawn, carrying himself with the posture of someone who believed his future had been permanently damaged by 30 seconds of poor decision-making. She knew that Marcus was learning important lessons about accountability and consequences, but she also worried that he was internalizing shame in ways that might become self-destructive rather than instructive. As they prepared for their court appearance, Patricia had tried to help Marcus understand that facing Judge Caprio was an opportunity to take responsibility for his actions, make amends to his community, and demonstrate that he was more than his worst moment. She had heard stories about Judge Caprio's reputation for fairness and his particular sensitivity to cases involving young people who had made mistakes. Still, she couldn't shake her worry that her son's future hung in the balance, that the judge's decision could either help Marcus get back on track or push him further down a path of believing he was destined for failure. Marcus, for his part, had spent the weeks before court alternating between hope that Judge Caprio might show leniency and terror that his dreams of college and a better future were about to be officially crushed by the legal system. He had written and rewritten an apology letter, practiced explanations for his behavior, and tried to prepare himself for whatever consequences awaited him. But underneath all his preparation lay a deeper question that he was afraid to voice. After making such a stupid mistake, did he deserve a second chance, or was this the beginning of a downward spiral that would define the rest of his life? The community center Marcus had vandalized served over 200 children every day, providing after-school programs, homework help, sports leagues, and a safe space for young people whose alternatives might include unsupervised time on streets where trouble was easy to find. The graffiti he and his friends had sprayed across its brick wall wasn't just property damage, it was an attack on a resource that many families depended on, painted by teenagers who should have understood better than anyone how valuable such programs could be in keeping young people out of exactly the kind of trouble they had just gotten themselves into. The Marcus Washington who had made that fateful decision on a Friday night in May was a young man caught between two worlds, the world of achievement and opportunity that his mother had worked so hard to provide for him, and the world of teenage peer pressure and the desire to fit in that had ultimately led to his downfall. To understand how an honor student and star athlete had found himself facing vandalism charges, it was necessary to understand the complex social dynamics that govern teenage behavior, and the way even the most well-raised young people can make decisions that seem completely out of character. Marcus had grown up in South Providence, a neighborhood where success stories like his were celebrated, but also sometimes viewed with suspicion by peers who saw academic achievement and athletic excellence as signs of acting white, or trying to be better than everyone else. Throughout middle school and his early high school years, Marcus had managed to navigate these social pressures successfully, maintaining his grades and athletic performance while also staying connected to neighborhood friends who didn't share his ambitions but respected his authenticity and loyalty. The trouble began during his junior year when several of his longtime friends began making choices that concerned Marcus and his mother. Some started skipping school regularly, others experimented with drugs and alcohol, and a few became involved in petty criminal activities that Marcus knew were dead-end paths. As his friends' interests diverged from his own, Marcus found himself increasingly isolated from his peer group, spending more time focused on basketball and academics but feeling lonely and disconnected from the social networks that had previously defined his identity. It was during this period of social uncertainty that Marcus met Jalen, Dante, and Rico, three older teenagers who seemed to embody a kind of confidence and street credibility that Marcus secretly envied. They were seniors who had already graduated but hadn't moved on to college or steady employment, instead spending their days hanging around the neighborhood, talking big about plans that never materialized, and engaging in the kind of low-level rebellious behavior that seemed exciting to a 17-year-old who had spent most of his life following rules and meeting expectations. When these older boys began including Marcus in their social circle, he felt a rush of acceptance that he hadn't experienced since his childhood friends had started drifting away. They treated him like an equal rather than a younger kid they had to tolerate, and they seemed impressed by his basketball skills and academic reputation in ways that made him feel valued for who he was rather than what he achieved. For a teenager struggling with questions of identity and belonging, their friendship offered something his honor roll status and athletic success couldn't provide, a sense of being genuinely accepted and respected by peers he admired. The night of the vandalism had started innocently enough. Marcus had finished basketball practice and was walking home when he encountered Jalen, Dante, and Rico hanging out near the community center. They invited him to join them, and Marcus, who had been feeling particularly isolated after a difficult day at school, agreed to spend some time with them before heading home to dinner and homework. The conversation was typical teenage banter, complaints about boring lives, dreams of making money and gaining respect, and the kind of aimless philosophizing that occupies young people who have energy but no clear direction for channeling it. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to more reckless topics. Jalen began talking about making their mark on the neighborhood, about doing something that would be remembered and talked about. He pulled out several cans of spray paint from his backpack, claiming he had been planning to decorate various walls around the area. When Dante suggested they start with the community center, Marcus felt his first pang of unease. He knew the community center was important to younger kids in the neighborhood, and he had spent many hours there himself during middle school. But Marcus also knew that expressing concerns would likely result in being labeled soft or scared, labels that would end his acceptance by this group and probably get back to other teenagers in the area. At 17, with a brain still developing its capacity for long-term thinking and risk assessment, Marcus made the calculation that seemed logical in that moment. Going along with the vandalism would take a few minutes, probably wouldn't cause serious harm, and would cement his status as someone who could be trusted to take risks when necessary. The actual act of spray painting the community center wall was completed in less than 10 minutes. Marcus and his friends tagged their street names in large, stylized letters across the brick facade, working quickly and glancing around nervously for security guards or police officers. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he participated, part of him thrilled by the rebellion and camaraderie, another part increasingly uncomfortable with what they were doing. But by the time his better judgment began to override the adrenaline and peer pressure, the damage was already done. The boys scattered quickly after completing their artwork, agreeing to meet up the following week to plan their next adventure. Marcus walked home feeling unsettled, but also oddly proud of having proven himself to the older boys. He went to bed that night without telling his mother where he had been or what he had done, convincing himself that the graffiti wasn't really a big deal and would probably be cleaned off within a few days without anyone making a fuss about it. The reality of his situation became clear the next morning when 2 police officers appeared at their apartment door with a warrant for Marcus's arrest. The community center security cameras had captured clear footage of all 4 boys vandalizing the building, and identifying them had been a simple matter of showing the video to community members who recognized the teenagers immediately. Marcus's world collapsed in the space of a few seconds as he watched his mother's face change from confusion to horror to heartbreak as she realized what her son had done. The arrest process was humiliating and terrifying for Marcus, who had never been in handcuffs or the back of a police car. But worse than the physical discomfort was the emotional devastation of seeing how his actions affected his mother. Patricia Washington had worked double shifts to pay for Marcus's basketball equipment and summer camps, had attended every game and parent-teacher conference, had sacrificed her own needs and desires to give her son every possible advantage in life. To see her son arrested for destroying property in their own community felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for and believed about the young man she had raised. During the weeks that followed, Marcus learned about the broader consequences of his 30 seconds of poor judgment. The community center's director, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a beloved figure in the neighborhood who had dedicated 20 years of her life to providing safe programming for local children. The graffiti on her building wasn't just property damage, it was a symbol of disrespect for her work and the hundreds of families who depended on the center's services. The cost of professional graffiti removal and repainting would strain the center's already tight budget, potentially forcing cuts to programs that served children who had few other safe places to spend their after-school hours. Most painful for Marcus was realizing that his actions had damaged not just a building, but his mother's reputation in their community. Patricia Washington was known and respected as a hard-working single mother who had raised her son right. Now, neighbors and co-workers looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, wondering how such a seemingly good kid had gone so wrong. Marcus began to understand that his choices didn't affect only him. They rippled out to impact everyone who cared about him and had invested in his success. "Marcus Washington," the court clerk announced, and the 17-year-old rose from his seat with the careful movements of someone trying to appear confident while feeling terrified. His mother Patricia stood beside him, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture of support that carried the weight of 17 years of unconditional love and 6 months of heartbreak. Together, they walked toward Judge Caprio's bench, Marcus's long stride automatically shortened to match his mother's pace, a small demonstration of the consideration and awareness that had made his poor decision so shocking to everyone who knew him. Judge Caprio looked up from the case file as they approached, immediately struck by something he had learned to recognize over his decades on the bench: the demeanor of a young person who was genuinely remorseful rather than simply sorry they had been caught. Marcus carried himself with a mixture of shame and determination that suggested he had spent considerable time thinking about what he had done and was prepared to accept responsibility for his actions. His mother's presence beside him radiated the kind of protective love that good parents show their children even when those children have made terrible mistakes. "Good morning, Marcus." "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved, but also the authority that reminded everyone present that this was a serious legal proceeding. "Marcus, I see here that you're charged with vandalism of the Elmwood Community Center. This is your first time in my courtroom, isn't it?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness that was evident in his posture. "This is my first time in any courtroom." The admission carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Marcus was acknowledging that he wasn't a habitual troublemaker, but rather someone whose presence in court represented a significant departure from his normal behavior. Judge Caprio nodded, appreciating the straightforward response. "Marcus, I've read the police report and I've seen the security camera footage. There's no question about what happened that night. But what I want to understand is why it happened. Can you tell me what led you to make the decision to vandalize the community center?" The question Marcus had been dreading and preparing for finally hung in the air between them. He had rehearsed various answers, considered different explanations, and tried to anticipate how he could describe his actions in a way that took responsibility while also helping the judge understand that this wasn't representative of who he really was. But standing before Judge Caprio, facing the direct gaze of someone who had heard every possible excuse and justification, Marcus found himself abandoning his prepared responses in favor of simple honesty. "Your Honor, I was with some older guys who I thought were cool, and they suggested we do the graffiti. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't want them to think I was scared or soft, so I went along with it." Marcus paused, gathering courage for the more difficult part of his explanation. "I can't blame peer pressure entirely though, because I'm 17 years old and I know the difference between right and wrong. I made a bad choice because I cared more about impressing those guys than I did about respecting my community." Judge Caprio was struck by the maturity of Marcus's response. Too often, teenage defendants in his courtroom tried to minimize their responsibility by blaming others or claiming they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. Marcus was taking ownership of his decision while also demonstrating that he had learned from it. "Tell me about yourself, Marcus," the judge said, leaning forward slightly. "What were you doing with your life before this happened?" Marcus straightened slightly, finding more confidence as he talked about the person he had been before that night in May. "I was on the honor roll at Classical High School, Your Honor. I played varsity basketball and was being looked at by some college scouts. I've never been in trouble before, and I was planning to study engineering in college." His voice grew quieter as he added, "I know I probably messed up those opportunities with what I did." Patricia Washington felt her heart break a little more as she heard her son articulate the dreams that his poor judgment had potentially destroyed. She had watched Marcus work incredibly hard to build a future for himself, had seen him make sacrifices and smart choices throughout his childhood and teenage years, only to see it all jeopardized by one night of trying to fit in with the wrong crowd. Judge Caprio turned his attention to Patricia. "Mrs. Washington, can you tell me about Marcus? What kind of young man was he before this incident?" Patricia took a breath, choosing her words carefully. She wanted to advocate for her son without making excuses for his behavior. "Your Honor, Marcus has always been a good kid. He works hard in school, he's respectful to adults, he helps around the house without being asked. He's never been in trouble before this, and I know he's been beating himself up about what he did every day since it happened." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I'm not saying what he did was okay, because it wasn't. But this one mistake doesn't represent who my son really is." The judge nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the pain in a mother's voice as she tried to balance accountability with advocacy. "Marcus, do you understand the impact of what you did that night? Not just the legal consequences, but the broader effects on your community." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice stronger now. "I learned that the community center serves over 200 kids every day, and that Mrs. Rodriguez has been running programs there for 20 years. The graffiti removal cost money that could have been used for programs, and it sent a message that some people in the neighborhood don't respect what the center does for younger kids." He looked directly at the judge as he continued. "I also know that I let down my mom, my teachers, my coaches, and everyone who believed in me. Most of all, I let myself down by acting like someone I'm not." Judge Caprio was impressed by the thoroughness of Marcus's understanding of his impact. It was clear that the young man had done significant reflection about his actions rather than simply preparing to say what he thought the judge wanted to hear. "Marcus, what have you learned from this experience?" the judge asked, genuinely curious about the teenager's insights. Marcus had thought about this question extensively during the sleepless nights since his arrest. "I learned that peer pressure is real, but it's not an excuse. I learned that my choices affect more people than just me. And I learned that respect isn't something you earn by doing stupid things with the wrong people. It's something you earn by making good decisions and standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard." He took a breath before continuing. "I also learned that second chances aren't guaranteed, Your Honor. I had opportunities that a lot of kids in my neighborhood don't get, and I almost threw them away for 30 seconds of trying to look tough. That's not just stupid, it's wasteful of all the sacrifices my mother made to give me those opportunities." The courtroom was quiet as everyone absorbed Marcus's words. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, processing what he had heard from this remarkable young man who seemed to have learned more from his mistake than many adults learn from years of poor decisions. Judge Caprio sat quietly for a long moment after Marcus finished speaking, his experienced eyes studying the young man before him with an expression that seemed to be weighing far more than just the legal facts of the case. In his 3 decades on the bench, the judge had encountered thousands of teenage defendants, and he had developed an intuitive ability to distinguish between young people who were genuinely remorseful and those who were simply putting on a performance to avoid consequences. What he saw in Marcus Washington was something that gave him hope, authentic remorse combined with genuine insight and a mature understanding of personal responsibility. When Judge Caprio finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. "Marcus, in all my years as a judge, I've seen a lot of young people come through this courtroom after making mistakes. Some of them try to blame everyone but themselves. Some of them make excuses. Some of them act like their actions don't matter because they're young. But what I've heard from you today is something different, and something that gives me tremendous hope for your future." The judge stood up from his bench, a gesture that immediately commanded the complete attention of everyone present. "You see, Marcus, what separates a mistake from a pattern of bad behavior is what a person learns from that mistake and how they choose to move forward. And from everything you've said today, it's clear to me that you've learned more from this one error in judgment than some people learn from years of making poor choices." Marcus felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months, though he tried not to let it show too much on his face. He had come to court prepared for the worst possible outcome, convinced that his future was about to be officially derailed by the legal system. Judge Caprio's words suggested that perhaps there might be another way forward. "But Marcus," the judge continued, his tone becoming more serious, "understanding what you did wrong is only the first step. The real question is, what are you going to do to make this right? Not just legally, but morally and personally. How are you going to turn this mistake into something that makes you and your community stronger?" Judge Caprio paused, looking directly at Marcus with an intensity that made the teenager feel as though the judge could see straight into his soul. "I want you to think about something, young man. Right now, you have a choice to make. You can let this mistake define you. Let it become the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you're capable of. Or you can use this as the moment you decided to become the man your mother raised you to be, the moment you chose to live up to your potential instead of shrinking away from it." The judge's words seemed to resonate through the courtroom, touching not just Marcus but everyone present who was witnessing this extraordinary moment of mentorship disguised as a legal proceeding. Patricia Washington felt tears welling up in her eyes as she heard someone articulate the choice that her son was facing in terms that captured both its difficulty and its importance. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want to make this right. I want to use this experience to become better, not to make excuses for being worse. I just don't know exactly how to do that." Judge Caprio smiled, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to light up the entire courtroom. "That's exactly the right answer, Marcus. The fact that you want to make it right is the most important thing. The how we can figure out together." The judge returned to his seat and opened Marcus's case file, but instead of reading from it, he began speaking with the passionate conviction of someone who had just been inspired. "Here's what I'm going to do, Marcus. Instead of just imposing a punishment that checks a legal box, I'm going to give you an opportunity to turn this mistake into one of the most important experiences of your life." Judge Caprio leaned forward, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm sentencing you to 100 hours of community service at the Elmwood Community Center, the same place you vandalized. But this isn't just about cleaning up your mess. I want you to work with Mrs. Rodriguez and her staff to help other young people in your community make better choices than you did." The unexpected nature of this sentence caused a murmur of surprise to ripple through the courtroom. Community service was common, but the specific requirement to work at the very place Marcus had damaged, and to use his experience to mentor other teenagers, was highly unusual. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with his unprecedented approach to Marcus's case. "Furthermore, I want you to prepare a presentation about your experience, the choices you made, the consequences you faced, and the lessons you learned, to present to other teenagers in the community. I want you to become living proof that smart, good kids can make terrible mistakes, but that those mistakes don't have to ruin their lives if they choose to learn from them." Marcus stood speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the realization that Judge Caprio was offering him something he had never dared to hope for, a chance to transform his worst moment into something meaningful and redemptive. "Your Honor, thank you. I promise I won't let you down." "Marcus," Judge Caprio said, his voice softening slightly, "I'm not just giving you a second chance because I'm a nice guy. I'm giving you this opportunity because I see something in you that I don't want our community to lose. You have intelligence, self-awareness, and the capacity for real leadership. But more than that, you have a mother who loves you enough to sacrifice for your success, and you have the moral foundation to know right from wrong even when peer pressure tries to convince you otherwise." The judge's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "What happened to you that night could happen to any teenager who finds themselves caught between wanting to fit in and knowing what's right. The difference is that most of them don't have your capacity for honest self-reflection or your ability to articulate what they've learned. I want you to use those gifts to help other young people avoid making the same mistake you made." Patricia Washington could no longer contain her tears as she listened to Judge Caprio not only offer her son redemption, but challenge him to become a leader and mentor to other young people. This was beyond anything she had dared to hope for when they had walked into the courtroom that morning. Judge Caprio stood up again, and this time he came out from behind his bench to stand directly in front of Marcus. "Young man, I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life. Not because it's the day you got in trouble, but because it's the day you chose to turn a mistake into a mission. I expect great things from you, Marcus Washington, and I believe you're going to exceed even my highest expectations." The judge extended his hand to Marcus, who shook it with a grip that conveyed both gratitude and determination. "Don't thank me yet," Judge Caprio said with a slight smile. "Thank me when you graduate from college, when you become the engineer you want to be, and when you can look back on this day as the moment you learned that your worst mistakes can become your greatest teachers if you have the courage to learn from them." The transformation that began in Judge Caprio's courtroom that November morning continued to unfold over the following months in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations, including Marcus's own. What had started as a legal obligation to complete community service at the Elmwood Community Center gradually evolved into something much more profound, a genuine calling to help other young people navigate the same social pressures and identity struggles that had led to his own moment of poor judgment. Marcus's first day at the community center was awkward and intimidating. Mrs. Rodriguez, the director whose building he had vandalized, greeted him with professional courtesy but understandable wariness. She had agreed to Judge Caprio's unusual sentencing arrangement, but she wasn't entirely sure what to expect from a teenager who had damaged her facility and was now being required to help maintain it. What she discovered over the following weeks, however, was a young man whose remorse was genuine and whose commitment to making amends went far beyond simply fulfilling his legal obligations. Initially, Marcus's tasks were straightforward: cleaning, organizing equipment, helping with maintenance projects, and assisting staff with basic administrative duties. But Mrs. Rodriguez quickly noticed that Marcus interacted naturally with the younger children who attended the center's after-school programs. He had a gift for connecting with kids who were struggling academically or socially, perhaps because his own recent experience with making poor choices had given him insights into the vulnerability that often underlies teenage bravado and rebellion. Within a month of starting his community service, Marcus had become an unofficial mentor to several middle school students who reminded him of himself at that age. Smart kids from single-parent households who were trying to balance academic achievement with the social pressures of growing up in a neighborhood where success was sometimes viewed with suspicion. He helped them with homework, played basketball with them during recreational periods, and gradually began sharing his own story as a cautionary tale about the importance of choosing friends wisely and staying true to personal values even when peer pressure made it difficult. The presentation that Judge Caprio had required Marcus to prepare became one of the most powerful anti-vandalism and peer pressure awareness programs the community had ever seen. Rather than delivering a dry lecture about following rules, Marcus told his story with raw honesty, describing the specific thoughts and emotions that had led to his poor decision and the devastating consequences that had followed. He didn't portray himself as a victim of circumstances, but rather as someone who had made a conscious choice to prioritize social acceptance over personal integrity, and who was still working to rebuild the trust and opportunities he had damaged. High school students who heard Marcus speak were struck by his authenticity and his willingness to expose his own vulnerability. Here was someone who had been where they were, who understood the complex social dynamics they navigated every day, and who could speak from experience rather than theory about the long-term costs of short-term poor decisions. Teachers reported that Marcus's presentation sparked more meaningful discussions about peer pressure and decision-making than any previous program they had hosted. The impact of Marcus's work extended beyond the teenagers he directly counseled. Mrs. Rodriguez began incorporating his story into the center's programming, using his experience as a foundation for broader discussions about community responsibility, the consequences of our choices, and the possibility of redemption through service to others. Marcus's willingness to own his mistake and transform it into a teaching tool became a model for how the center approached discipline and conflict resolution with the children they served. 6 months after his sentencing, Marcus returned to Judge Caprio's chambers for a follow-up visit that the judge had requested to check on his progress. The young man who walked into the office bore little resemblance to the shame-faced teenager who had stood before the bench months earlier. Marcus carried himself with a confidence that came not from avoiding consequences, but from having faced them honestly and used them as a foundation for growth. "Judge Caprio," Marcus said, shaking the older man's hand with genuine warmth, "I wanted to thank you again for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself. The community service you sentenced me to has changed my life in ways I never expected." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know this sounds strange, but getting arrested for vandalism might have been the best thing that ever happened to me, because it brought me to your courtroom and gave me the chance to discover what I'm really meant to do with my life." Judge Caprio smiled, clearly pleased but not surprised by Marcus's transformation. "Tell me what you mean by that, son." "Well, sir, I started out just trying to complete my hours and stay out of further trouble," Marcus explained. "But working with the younger kids at the center made me realize how much I love teaching and mentoring. I've decided that I want to become a teacher, maybe eventually a principal, so I can work with young people who are facing the same kinds of challenges I faced. I want to help them make better choices than I did, and show them that their mistakes don't have to define their futures." The judge nodded approvingly. "That's wonderful, Marcus. But what about your engineering plans? What about college basketball?" Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "I'm still going to college, Your Honor, and I'm still hoping to play basketball if possible. But I've changed my major to education with a minor in counseling. The engineering can wait, Right now, I feel called to work with young people. And actually, the basketball coach at Classical High School has been talking to me about possibly reinstating me for the rest of the season, now that I've shown I'm serious about turning my life around. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus describing the specific young people he was working with at the community center, the positive changes he was seeing in their academic performance and behavior, and his plans for expanding his peer counseling work during his senior year of high school. Judge Caprio listened with the satisfaction of someone who had made exactly the right decision at exactly the right moment. "Marcus," the judge said as their meeting drew to a close, "I want you to know that what you've accomplished over these past 6 months represents one of the most successful outcomes I've ever seen from a case in my courtroom. You've proven that young people can learn from their mistakes, that consequences don't have to be purely punitive, and that sometimes the best way to heal from hurting others is to dedicate yourself to helping them.